The call came in at 4 minutes past 3 in the morning. The patrol officer's voice was steady, but the background noise was wrong. Too hollow, too metallic, too still. A delivery van had been reported idling behind an abandoned textile mill near the Eastern Freight Line. No driver visible. No headlights. No hazard lights. Engine running. The rear doors were locked from the outside. When the officer forced them open, cold air spilled into the alley like breath from something mechanical and patient. Inside were 3 industrial freezers bolted to the cargo floor. 2 were empty. The third was not. The man inside was alive when they found him. If you're listening closely to these cases, pay attention to the details others ignore. They're the difference between a coincidence and a pattern. The victim's name was Daniel Hurst. 38 years old. Self-employed logistics consultant. No known criminal record. No immediate enemies. No recent police reports filed in his name. He had not been reported missing. Not yet. He was naked from the waist up. His wrists were zip-tied but not tightly. No tape over the mouth. No restraints on the ankles. There were bruises, but not defensive wounds. That was the first thing Rachel Monroe noticed when she stepped into the refrigerated cargo hold. No defensive wounds. No broken fingernails. No torn skin from struggling against confinement. No blunt force trauma to the skull. The freezer interior had been modified. Reinforced steel lining. Industrial coolant unit wired to an external power inverter connected to the van battery. A small oxygen port drilled into the rear panel. This was not an impulsive crime. This was engineered. Daniel Hurst's core temperature was dangerously low, but not immediately fatal. He drifted in and out of consciousness as paramedics worked to stabilize him. His eyes fluttered open once. Rachel leaned close enough to hear him over the hum of the cooling unit. He said I could leave. Hurst whispered. Then he passed out. There are moments in a case when a sentence shifts everything, not because it explains something, but because it complicates it. He said I could leave. Monroe did not respond immediately. She stepped back out into the alley and surveyed the perimeter. No tire marks distinct enough to isolate. The van's plates were cloned. VN filed off. The freezer serial numbers had been chemically stripped. Professional, but not invisible. Inside the cargo hold, on the steel lining beside the freezer door, someone had carved 3 words with deliberate, careful strokes. He chose this. Not scratched in panic. Etched. Intentional. Daniel Hurst was transported to St. Bartholomew Medical Center under critical condition. By 9 that morning, Monroe had already pulled his financial records. 2 weeks prior, Hurst had transferred a significant sum of money, nearly half his liquid savings, to a shell company registered under a generic corporate filing. The company name was Second Horizon Holdings. No website. No listed executives. Incorporated 3 months ago. Monroe requested expedited corporate registry extraction. The filing attorney's signature was digital. The address listed belonged to a rented mailbox facility 2 districts south. By midday, forensic technicians had confirmed something else. There were no signs of forced entry inside the van. The rear cargo doors had been locked from the outside, but Daniel Hurst's fingerprints were found on the inner handle of the freezer lid. From the inside. The implication was impossible to ignore. He had entered willingly, or he believed he had. By late afternoon, Daniel Hurst went into cardiac arrest. He did not recover. Cause of death, hypothermic shock leading to cardiac arrhythmia. But that was not what unsettled Rachel Monroe. It was the consent. When Hurst's apartment was searched under warrant, detectives recovered a printed document on his kitchen table. Title: Participation Agreement, 3 pages long. The document described a controlled endurance challenge involving exposure tolerance and psychological resilience metrics. It promised a financial reward upon completion. It included waivers acknowledging temporary discomfort and managed environmental conditions. There was a signature at the bottom, Daniel Hurst's. Initials on every page. Monroe read it twice. There was no explicit mention of confinement, no mention of refrigeration, no mention of life-threatening exposure. But the language was vague enough to obscure risk. It had been drafted carefully, intentionally ambiguous, legally insulated. The payment record confirmed that Hurst had paid a security deposit to participate. Participants do not usually pay to be victims. At 5:42 that evening, a second call came in. Another van. Different district. Same model. Engine running. This one contained 3 freezers. All empty, but carved into the steel lining of the third unit were new words. You signed. Rachel Monroe did not feel surprise. She felt acceleration. This was not a single engineered death. This was a system. And somewhere in the city, someone else had signed. If you follow evidence over assumptions, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, based on what you've heard so far, does the timeline feel intentional or accidental? By 6 in the evening, the second van had been sealed and transported to the forensic bay. Detective Mel Monroe stood inside the stereo examination hangar as technicians moved methodically around the vehicle. The pattern was already tightening. Same model van, same aftermarket coolant system, same inverter configuration, same industrial-grade steel reinforcement lining the interior of the freezer compartment. Different district, no body, which meant one of two things. Either the offender had escalated, or someone was still alive. If you follow these cases carefully, you already know the truth hides in repetition. Patterns are never decoration. They are instruction. The carved message in the second freezer was clean. Controlled pressure, identical blade width to the first carving. You signed. Rachel studied the lettering spacing. Same height. Same measured stroke order. The cuts began with vertical pressure, then horizontal, then finishing drag on the terminal lines. Right-handed, patient, comfortable with tools. Forensics confirmed no usable prints. The interior had been wiped with an alcohol-based solvent, but wiping leaves patterns too. The streaks on the steel panels moved in overlapping circular motions, not rushed. Someone took their time. Monroe requested full trace on coolant supply chains within a 50-mile radius. Industrial freezer modification required specialty components. Someone had sourced them. Back at the precinct, financial crimes analysts dug deeper into Second Horizon Holdings. The mailbox facility had a camera facing the rental counter. Grainy footage showed a man in a neutral gray cap and disposable gloves signing the lease paperwork 2 months earlier. The face was partially obscured. No visible tattoos, no identifying marks, but posture tells its own story. He stood upright, shoulders squared, no sign of anxiety, no hesitation when handing over identification. The ID used was fraudulent, clean enough to pass surface inspection, not good enough to survive database cross-reference, fabricated identity, planned infrastructure, not spontaneous. Daniel Hurst's phone records revealed something else. 2 weeks before his death, he had spent 40 minutes on a call with an unregistered number. That number routed through encrypted VoIP masking. The call ended at 11:17 at night. 3 days later, he signed the participation agreement. Monroe ordered digital forensics to reconstruct deleted emails from Hurst's laptop. Within hours, fragments surfaced. Subject line: final confirmation. Body text partially recoverable. Reminder: all participants retain agency. You may exit at any time prior to the endurance phase. Exit at any time. The wording echoed in Monroe's mind. He said I could leave. By 8:22 that night, patrol units responded to a third location. This time, the van had not been discovered idling. It had been abandoned with engine off behind a shuttered grocery warehouse. Inside 3 freezers, 1 active. When officers forced it open, they found condensation on the interior lining, but no body. The coolant system was still cold. Someone had been inside recently. Very recently. Monroe arrived within 12 minutes. She crouched near the freezer threshold and studied the floor panel. There were faint scuff marks on the steel base. From inside, the oxygen port was slightly bent inward. Someone had kicked it. Hard. The inner latch handle showed scratch marks inconsistent with the first 2 units. These were frantic, jagged, not controlled. This participant had tried to get out, which meant the promise of voluntary exit had failed. And that meant the offender was lying. A folded sheet of paper lay inside the freezer corner, damp but intact. Participation agreement. Different name, Emily Carver. Age 29. Graduate student. No criminal history. Initials on every page. Monroe felt something colder than the refrigerated air. The system was accelerating. 2 confirmed participants. 1 deceased. 1 missing. And the offender was leaving behind documentation intentionally. By midnight, Emily Carver's apartment had been entered under emergency authorization. Her laptop was open on the dining table. Browser history partially wiped, but cached fragments remained. Search queries included extreme endurance experiments, paid exposure challenge urban, psychological resilience trial volunteer. She had been looking for something. Or someone had been targeting individuals already looking. Monroe called in cyber investigations to trace ad placements linked to the shell company. Within hours, they identified something subtle. There was no public website for Second Horizon Holdings. But sponsored content links had appeared intermittently on obscure forums focused on extreme self-improvement, biohacking, and endurance psychology, not mass advertising, selective infiltration. The ads used language almost identical to the agreement text. Test your limits. Retain control. Walk away anytime. Walk away anytime. At 1:37 in the morning, hospital staff called Monroe directly. A man had arrived at the emergency entrance on foot, severely hypothermic, disoriented, frostbite forming along the fingers. He collapsed before giving his name. When they checked his wallet, it confirmed her suspicion. His name was Aaron Patel. Inside his jacket pocket was a folded contract. Participation agreement. This time, there were handwritten notes in the margin. Under the clause referencing voluntary exit prior to endurance phase, someone had circled the sentence and written, he said phase starts after door closes. Rachel Monroe drove to the hospital without activating sirens. She needed him conscious. She needed clarity. Aaron Patel regained partial awareness at 2:18 in the morning. Monroe stood at his bedside as monitors beeped in careful rhythm. You signed, she said evenly. He swallowed. Yes, why? He stared at the ceiling. He said, it proves something. That most people quit too soon. Did you know you would be locked inside a freezer? He said, controlled cold exposure. Safe thresholds. I could leave whenever I wanted. Could you? Aaron's lips trembled. There was no handle on the outside. Monroe's gaze sharpened. The latch. It was there, but once it shut, something blocked it. The oxygen port bent inward. The frantic scratches. This offender was not offering exit. He was offering illusion. Monroe stepped back from the bedside and considered the trajectory. 3 vans. 3 sets of freezers. 3 contracts. 1 dead. 1 missing. 1 alive? Barely. The offender was not selecting random victims. He was recruiting. And the recruitment language centered on a single psychological pressure point, choice. But if there was no true choice, then the carved messages were not commentary. They were justification. He chose this. You signed. The offender needed the victims to appear complicit, because somewhere in his mind, that changed what he was doing. At 3:12 in the morning, Monroe received confirmation that a 4th sponsored link had just gone live on an endurance psychology forum. The text read, Final openings. Limited participants. Prove your threshold. The payment gateway was active, and someone had already submitted a deposit. At 3:12 in the morning, the payment notification hit the financial crimes dashboard. Another deposit. Same routing structure. Same intermediary transfer chain. Same digital wallet fragmentation before consolidation into an offshore holding account. The timestamp mattered. The sponsored link had gone live 6 minutes earlier. Someone had been waiting for it. Detective Rachel Monroe did not authorize a takedown. Not yet. Shutting the gateway would protect the next potential victim, but it would also alert the offender that law enforcement was inside his system. And this offender planned infrastructure, planned language, planned psychology. Impatience would cost leverage. Cyber forensics isolated the originating IP for the newest deposit. It resolved to a residential building on the western edge of the city, not a proxy, not masked, which meant one of 2 things. Either the offender had grown careless, or the participant had already been contacted directly. Monroe dispatched 2 plainclothes units to the building with instructions observe first. No contact unless necessary. Inside the cyber lab, analysts reconstructed the ad deployment architecture. The links were not broadcast widely. They were embedded inside comment replies under specific threads. Threads discussing failure. Threads discussing burnout. Threads discussing physical plateau. threads where users expressed frustration at their own perceived weakness. The algorithm was selective. The offender was reading people before approaching them. Aaron Patul's interview resumed at 9 that morning. His core temperature had stabilized, though his hands remained heavily bandaged. Rachel positioned a recorder on the bedside table. "Walk me through first contact." Aaron's eyes remained unfocused, but his voice steadied as he spoke. "I posted on a forum about quitting a marathon halfway. I wrote that I always back out when it gets uncomfortable. And someone replied, said discomfort isn't the same as danger. Said most people confuse the two. Username, Second Horizon." The name carried weight now. He messaged privately. Aaron continued, said he ran endurance trials. Psychological conditioning. Safe. Controlled. He said the freezer was symbolic. Symbolic of what? Breaking the exit reflex. Rachel did not respond immediately. Explain. He said when the door closes, your brain panics. It tells you to leave, but the body can survive longer than the mind believes. He said I'd have an internal latch. Oxygen regulated. Safe margins. He said if I truly wanted out, I could leave before the endurance phase began. Done. When did the endurance phase begin? Aaron's throat tightened. When the door sealed. That sentence sat in the room like frost. Rachel asked the question carefully. Was there anything preventing the latch from opening? Aaron hesitated. There was resistance. Like something shifted outside when it shut. I couldn't pull it open. A mechanical obstruction. Pre-installed. The illusion of agency had been built into the design. Back at the Western Residential Building, surveillance reported movement. The IP address corresponded to a third-floor apartment registered to a name Neckel Rao, 26, graduate researcher in behavioral neuroscience. No prior record. Monroe reviewed his background file as units observed the entrance. Published papers on stress response thresholds. Cold exposure adaptation. Decision-making under perceived loss of control. The pattern tightened further. She instructed surveillance to monitor exits only. Do not approach. If Rao was merely a participant, confronting him would drive him directly into the offender's hands. At 11:45, Rao exited the building carrying a backpack. He did not appear distressed. He did not appear coerced. He walked toward a bus stop. Plainclothes officers followed at distance. Rachel reviewed Daniel Hurst's autopsy again. There had been minimal struggle in the first case, which meant Hurst likely believed the system would release him. Until it didn't. Emily Carver remained missing. No financial movement, no phone signal, no surveillance hits. But the third van's freezer had shown frantic escape attempts. That meant at least one participant realized the deception before losing consciousness, which meant the offender adjusted between victims. Daniel Hurst. Calm. Emily Carver. Panic. Aaron Patel. Partial survival. This was iteration. Experimentation. By early afternoon, digital forensics identified something critical. The shell company's incorporation paperwork had been filed from a public terminal inside a co-working space 3 months earlier. Monroe pulled the reservation logs. One recurring booking matched the date and time of filing. Name Dr. Elias Voss. Age 41. Licensed psychologist. Specialization in cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure-based treatment models. Rachel stared at the file for a long moment. Exposure-based treatment. Controlled confrontation of feared stimuli. Gradual desensitization. She requested Voss's practice address. It was active. Operational. Respectable. No complaints filed. Client reviews described him as intense but effective. Surveillance units were redirected to the clinic. At 3:10 in the afternoon, Monroe stood across the street from Elias Voss's office building. She did not enter. Not yet. Inside, a waiting room filled with quiet patients suggested legitimacy. The offender had not built this system impulsively. He had layered it under credibility, a man who believed in exposure, believed in endurance, believed weakness was voluntary. She requested a financial cross-match between Voss and Second Horizon Holdings. The results returned within the hour. No direct transfers. But the offshore consolidation wallet receiving deposits had once routed a small consulting payment to a corporate account registered to Voss's practice. 3 months ago, a test transaction. Small enough to avoid flagging. large enough to confirm linkage. Rachel's phone vibrated. Surveillance on Nikhil Rao reported that he had exited a bus 2 districts north and was now walking toward an industrial corridor, the same corridor where Daniel Hurst's van had been found. Rao's pace was steady, purposeful. He stopped at a convenience store and purchased bottled water, then continued walking. Monroe made the decision. Intercept him before he reaches any vehicle. Plainclothes officers approached Rao casually, identified themselves, requested conversation. Rao's pulse visibly quickened. "Did someone contact you about a trial?" Our officer asked. Rao hesitated. "Wes, where are you going?" Rao looked past them. "I have an appointment." "With who?" "With Hood. Dr. Voss." Rachel received the update in real time. She did not wait for further confirmation. She crossed the street toward Elias Voss's clinic. The glass door reflected her expression back at her. Controlled, measured, unhurried. Inside, a receptionist greeted her calmly. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," Rachel said evenly. "With Dr. Voss." She displayed her badge. The receptionist's smile faltered. Moments later, Elias Voss stepped into the hallway. He was composed, mid-40s, clean-shaven, calm eyes. "Detective," he said pleasantly. "How can I help you?" Monroe studied him. No tremor, no visible tension, no surprise. "You run a secondary organization," she said. "Second Horizon Holdings." Voss tilted his head slightly. "I consult under several names. Participants are paying to be locked inside industrial freezers." His expression did not change. "Participants engage in controlled exposure trials designed to challenge cognitive avoidance. Daniel Hurst is dead." There was a pause. Measured. Then Voss replied softly. Daniel signed. The words were almost identical to the carved steel. "You signed. He chose this." Rachel held his gaze. "Your freezer latch systems are externally obstructed." Voss's brow tightened for the first time. "That's not possible." War recovered one participant alive. He described resistance on the latch. Silence stretched. A crack in composure, slight but present. "If someone modified the equipment," Voss said carefully, "that would be outside my protocol." Rachel's voice remained steady. "How many trials have you conducted?" 3. "How many participants are currently active?" Voss did not answer immediately, and that hesitation was the first honest thing in the room. Because somewhere, at that very moment, someone else might already be inside a freezer, believing they could leave. Dr. Elias Voss did not answer the question. How many participants are currently active? The silence in the hallway stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for calculation. Long enough for someone trained in cognitive control to decide what version of truth to offer. "Active is a broad term," Voss said finally. Rachel Monroe did not blink. "How many people have paid you and have not yet completed your so-called endurance phase?" Voss folded his hands loosely in front of him. No defensive posture, no raised voice. 4, he said. 4. Daniel Hurst, deceased. Emily Carver, missing. Aaron Patel, alive. Nikhil Rao, intercepted before arrival. That accounted for all of them. Unless there were more. "You told each of them they could leave at any time," Rachel said.
"Yes."
"But once the door closes, the latch becomes obstructed. That is not part of the protocol." Rachel watched him carefully. "You built the units." "I commissioned modifications." "From whom?" "A fabricator listed under industrial refrigeration retrofits." "Name?" Voss hesitated again, shorter this time. "Marcus Lynn." The name was unfamiliar. Rachel signaled to an officer behind her to run it immediately. "You're aware one participant died," she said. "Yes." "And your response?" Voss exhaled slowly. "Hypothermia thresholds vary by individual." Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He was alive when officers found him." "He said you told him he could leave." "He could. But he couldn't." "That would suggest equipment failure." Rachel stepped slightly closer. "Doctor, 3 separate freezer units show mechanical interference preventing internal latch release. Identical design flaw. Identical obstruction behavior. That is not failure." That for the first time irritation surfaced in Voss's expression. Detective exposure therapy requires controlled discomfort. If a participant exits too quickly, the intervention loses efficacy. There's a difference between discomfort and confinement. Voss did not respond. Rachel shifted direction. What is the endurance phase? He paused. It begins once the subject voluntarily closes the freezer door. Define voluntarily. They step inside and shut it. And after that, they experience the stimulus. No time limit. They are instructed to push past the first wave of panic. Rachel's voice hardens slightly. And when they attempt to open the latch, they can. Except they can't. Silence again. Behind Rachel, an officer approached quietly. Marcus Len, he said low enough for Voss not to hear clearly. Industrial metal worker. Prior conviction for unlawful confinement 12 years ago. Reduced sentence. No recent record. Rachel's eyes remained locked on Voss. Your fabricator has a history. I wasn't aware, Voss said quickly. Of unlawful confinement. No. Rachel turned slightly toward the officer. Location. Warehouse lease under Len's name expired 2 months ago. No current registered business address. Of course not. Doctor. Rachel continued. Where are the units stored between trials? Voss hesitated longer this time. They are mobile. In vans. Yes. Where are the vans kept? They are rented. Under whose name? Second Horizon. Rachel's patience narrowed. You told participants they could exit at any time. Yes. And yet mechanical obstruction appeared immediately upon door closure. That was not my intention. Rachel studied him for several seconds. There are offenders who enjoy control. There are offenders who enjoy harm. And there are offenders who convince themselves they are conducting improvement. Voss did not look like a man who believed he was killing people. He looked like a man who believed discomfort purified weakness, which made him more dangerous. Her phone vibrated. A message from Cyber Forensics. New login to Second Horizon admin panel. Remote access. Different IP. Industrial District East. Rachel looked back at Voss. Who else has access to your system? No one. Your admin panel was just accessed. That landed. His eyes flickered. Genuine surprise this time. That's impossible. It happened 12 seconds ago. Rachel turned to the officer. Trace exact location. Coordinates resolved quickly. An industrial substation near the freight rail corridor. The same corridor where the first van had been found. Rachel made the decision instantly. Detain Dr. Voss. Bring him in. Voss stiffened. You're making a mistake. My work is therapeutic. My participant is dead. One is missing. That's not. You can explain downtown. Officers moved to secure him. Rachel was already walking toward the exit. If someone else had accessed the admin panel, it meant one thing. Either Voss was lying about sole control, or someone had hijacked the system. And if someone else was running trials outside his awareness, then the carved messages made more sense. He chose this. You signed. Those weren't clinical. They were accusatory. The industrial substation sat between two abandoned freight warehouses. Minimal lighting. Limited traffic at night. Units arrived within minutes. No visible vehicles in the lot. But behind the substation fence sat a familiar silhouette. White cargo van. Engine off. Rear doors closed. Rachel approached cautiously as officers secured the perimeter. No immediate movement. She placed a gloved hand against the metal door. Cold, very cold. Which meant the unit inside was running. Force it, she ordered. The doors were pried open. 3 freezers. 1 active. The hum was steady. Mechanical. Relentless. Rachel stepped forward herself this time. She pulled the freezer handle upward. The seal resisted for half a second before breaking. Cold vapor spilled outward. Inside was Emily Carver. Unconscious. Pulse faint. Skin pale with early frostbite along the forearms. Her wrists were free. The internal latch handle showed deep scratch marks. But there was something new. Bolted above the latch was a sliding steel plate. Externally triggered. That dropped into place once the door sealed. Mechanical obstruction. Intentional. Not failure. Rachel's gaze shifted to the interior wall. The carved message was longer this time. You wanted to be stronger. No mention of signing. No mention of choice. This message was different. It was personal. Paramedics pulled Emily from the unit and initiated rewarming protocols. Rachel stepped back and scanned the cargo area. On the van floor near the driver's seat lay a toolkit, industrial-grade bolts, metal shavings, fresh drill bit residue. This unit had been modified recently, which meant someone had changed Voss's design, or improved it. An officer called out from the perimeter. "Detective." She turned. A man was running along the rail line behind the substation fence, mid-30s, work jacket, carrying something metallic in his right hand. Rachel did not hesitate. "Stop," she shouted. He vaulted a low barrier and continued running. Officers gave chase. The metallic object slipped from his hand as he stumbled briefly. It clanged against gravel. Rachel moved toward it. It was a sliding steel plate mechanism, identical to the one bolted inside the freezer. The fabricator, Marcus Len, he wasn't building units. He was enhancing them. And he was still out there. Marcus Len did not run like a man panicking. He ran like a man who had calculated distance. The freight corridor behind the substation offered long sight lines and minimal cover. Gravel shifted beneath his boots as he cut between rusted rail spurs and discarded timber ties. Officers gained ground, but not quickly enough to make it simple. Rachel Monroe did not shout again. She watched. Len's stride shortened slightly as he veered toward a maintenance ladder welded onto the side of a low-signal tower. He climbed without hesitation, not improvising. Pre-planned. Two officers split direction, anticipating the descent point. Len reached the top platform, glanced once over his shoulder, then jumped toward an adjacent loading awning. He landed hard, rolled, recovered. But he had misjudged the surface. Corrugated metal dipped under his weight. His balance faltered for half a second. That half second was enough. An officer tackled him before he reached the opposite edge. Len hit the metal roof face first. No weapon drawn. No fight beyond the first instinctive struggle. Then stillness. He did not beg. He did not deny. He stared forward, breathing hard, as cuffs closed around his wrists. Rachel reached the roof moments later. "You improved the latch system," she said evenly. Len did not answer. "You installed the external slide plate." Silence. "You prevented exit." His jaw tightened. They wanted the experience. Rachel crouched to his level. They wanted control. They wanted discipline. They wanted to prove they wouldn't quit. "That's not what you gave them." Len's breathing steadied. "I gave them the truth." "What truth?" "That when the door closes, there is no exit. That's when you find out who you are." Rachel studied him carefully. His effect was not chaotic, it was certain. "You carved the messages." "Yes." "Why?" "Because they needed to own it. He chose this." Rachel repeated. Lan nodded faintly. "You signed," she added. "Yes. And Emily Carver." A pause. "You wanted to be stronger." Rachel finished. Len's gaze sharpened slightly. She wrote that in her intake questionnaire. So he had access. Full access. "You were monitoring the admin panel tonight." "Yes." "Without Dr. Voss's knowledge." Lan smiled slightly for the first time. "He thinks he's conducting therapy. And you." "I'm removing illusion." Rachel let that sit. "You altered his design after Daniel Hurst died."
Wes.
"Why?" "Because Daniel tried to exit too soon." "He couldn't exit at all." "He shouldn't have." Rachel's voice remained level. "He died." Len did not look away. He chose to close the door. There it was. Total inversion of responsibility. Rachel stood. "Take him in." As officers lifted Len to his feet, she looked toward the substation yard below. Emily Carver was being loaded into an ambulance. Oxygen mask secured. Skin slowly regaining tone under thermal blankets. Aaron Patel had survived. Emily might survive. Daniel had not. The pattern was now clear. Dr. Elias Voss designed psychological exposure trials rooted in voluntary discomfort. Marcus Len weaponized them. He replaced agency with inevitability. He transformed experiment into confinement. Back at the precinct, interrogation rooms filled quickly. Voss in one. Len in another. Rachel chose Len first. He sat upright, wrists cuffed to the table ring. No visible anxiety. "You monitored intake forms," she began. "Wes. You selected participants based on psychological profile. I selected those who blamed themselves." "Why?" Because they wouldn't call it assault. Rachel let the words echo. You installed obstruction plates on every unit. Yes. How many total units? 6. Where are the other 2? In storage. Location. He gave it without hesitation. An abandoned refrigeration warehouse under a false sublease. Were there additional participants beyond the 4 we identified? Lan tilted his head. Not yet. Rachel leaned forward slightly. You escalated messaging between victims. Less. Why? First one believed in choice. Daniel. Less. Second panicked. Emily. Less. So you adjusted the message. He nodded. She needed to believe it was personal. Rachel held his gaze. You wanted to be stronger. Less. That wasn't therapy. No. It was punishment. Len's expression hardened. It was clarity. Rachel shifted topics. You accessed the admin panel tonight. Less. Why? To confirm Rao had paid. And then? I was preparing the VAM. For him. Yes. You were going to install the slide plate? Yes. Even though you knew police were investigating Daniel Hurst's death. He shrugged slightly. They always investigate. You didn't think you'd be caught. He considered that. I thought most of them would survive. The sentence landed colder than the freezers. Most. Rachel repeated. He did not correct himself. In the adjacent interrogation room, Voss was less composed. When confronted with images of the slide plate mechanism, his hands trembled for the first time. That's not my design, he insisted. You commissioned the units. Yes, but that plate wasn't there. It was in 3 separate vans. Voss shook his head. I wanted controlled exposure. Monitored. Timed. Timed how? They were supposed to message me before entering. Did they? Daniel did. Rachel studied the message logs recovered from the admin server. Daniel had sent a final message. Door closed. Beginning phase. No response had been logged. Instead, admin access had switched to Len's credentials. You lost control of your system, Rachel said. Voss's voice cracked slightly. I didn't authorize obstruction. But you authorized confinement. It was voluntary. It was misleading. Voss covered his face briefly. I thought they needed to confront discomfort. Rachel's voice remained steady. You built a scenario where panic was guaranteed. That was the point. And you removed safe exit thresholds. That wasn't. It was inevitable. Silence filled the room. Back in Len's interrogation, Rachel asked the final necessary question. When did you decide to alter the system? After reading their intake forms. What about them? They hated themselves for quitting. And? I removed the option to quit. Rachel sat back. You killed Daniel Hurst. Len did not argue. You nearly killed Emily Carver. Silence. You intended to lock Nikhil Rao inside next. Yes. Rachel closed the file. Outside the room, evidence teams were already moving toward the storage warehouse Len had identified. 6 units total. 3 used. 3 unused, which meant the cycle would have continued. Recruitment, payment, illusion of choice, mechanical carved message. Until someone didn't survive. Daniel Hurst had not survived. Emily Carver's condition remained critical but stable. Aaron Patel would carry frostbite scars for the rest of his life. And Nikhil Rao was sitting in an interview room 2 floors up, shaken but unharmed. The carved phrases were not taunts to police. They were absolution scripts. He chose this. You signed. You wanted to be stronger. Marcus Len believed he was removing weakness. In reality, he was removing consent. And without consent, there is no endurance trial. There is only confinement. By the time the storage warehouse was breached, the pattern had stopped being theoretical. It was physical. The building sat in a neglected refrigeration corridor, once used for produce distribution. The exterior signage had been stripped. Windows painted over. Loading docks sealed with rusted chains that looked older than they were. Inside, the air smelled of coolant and iron. 6 industrial freezer units lined the central floor in precise alignment. 3 bore signs of recent use. 3 were pristine. Rachel Monroe stepped inside slowly, taking in the geometry, identical dimensions. Identical reinforcement lining. Identical oxygen ports. Identical mounting brackets for the sliding obstruction plate. The plate mechanism had been removed from the unused units, which meant Len installed them per trial. One at a time, evidence technicians documented tool impressions along the bolt housings. The scratch pattern matched the tool kit recovered at the substation van. Len had not been improvising. He had been refining. On a folding table against the far wall sat intake files, printed, annotated, categorized, each participant's psychological questionnaire clipped together with payment confirmation and emergency contact details. Daniel Hurst's file contained a single handwritten note in the margin, strong denial response. High self-criticism. Emily Carver's file, performance anxiety. Fear of plateau. Aaron Patal's file, self-blame pattern. Marathon withdrawal event. Nickel Rao's file was on top of the unused stack. Rachel flipped it open. Research fixation on stress tolerance. Competitive self-comparison. Susceptible to threshold challenge. The language was clinical, but the undercurrent was predatory. Len had not selected random volunteers. He had targeted individuals who framed their setbacks as personal failure. People who would interpret suffering as deserved. That was the real mechanism. Not steel plates. Not coolant systems. Self-blame. Back at the precinct, Voss requested to speak again. Rachel entered the interrogation room without a file. "You let him access intake forms?" she said. "I didn't think he was unstable." "You didn't think he was violent?" "No." "You didn't think he would escalate your design?" "No." Rachel leaned back slightly. "You built an experiment dependent on panic." Voss closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "You told them discomfort is not danger." "Yes." "But you controlled neither the discomfort nor the danger." Silence. "You framed it as voluntary," Rachel continued. "But the psychological pressure you applied narrowed that choice." Voss swallowed. "They reached out to me." "And you told them quitting was weakness." "I told them avoidance reinforces fear." "You told them closing the door would reveal who they are." Voss's voice softened. "I believed that." Rachel studied him. He did not look like Len. Len believed suffering clarified truth. Voss believed structured suffering built resilience. Both removed safety. Only one added inevitability. Daniel Hurst died believing he could leave. Rachel said quietly. Voss looked down. "I didn't obstruct the latch." "But you obstructed informed consent." That landed harder than accusation. Because he understood the distinction. Upstairs, Aaron Patal agreed to give a recorded statement. Rachel listened from behind the observation glass. "I don't think he wanted to kill us," Aaron said weakly. "Which one?" the interviewer asked. "The doctor." "And the other?" Aaron hesitated. "He wanted to prove something." "What?" "That we only panic because we expect escape." Rachel turned away from the glass. That sentence echoed the core of it. The sliding plate had not just blocked exit. It had removed hope. And once hope is removed, panic becomes oxygen. Emily Carver regained consciousness that evening. Disoriented, in pain, but alive. Rachel visited briefly. Emily's voice was hoarse. "I tried the latch," she whispered. "I know." "He said I could leave before the face." "I know." When the door closed, something shifted. Rachel nodded once. "Did he communicate during the trial?" Emily blinked slowly. "I heard a noise outside. Metal sliding. The plate." Emily swallowed. "He wanted to see how long I'd last." Rachel did not correct her, because that was accurate. Later that night, Marcus Len requested legal counsel. Before the attorney arrived, he asked one final question through the door. Did any of them last longer than expected? Rachel stood outside the cell. "Yes," she said. "Who?" "Emily." He absorbed that, then nodded once, almost satisfied. That reaction confirmed everything. This had never been about therapy. It had been about measurement, about thresholds, about removing exit to see what remained. The next morning, charges were filed. Marcus Len, first-degree murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, fraud, Elias Voss, criminal negligence resulting in death, reckless endangerment, fraudulent misrepresentation. The difference in charges reflected intent. Len had engineered inevitability. Voss had engineered illusion. In her office, Rachel placed the 3 carved message photographs side by side. He chose this. You signed. You wanted to be stronger. 3 variations of the same absolution, each designed to shift responsibility. But responsibility does not transfer through language. It remains with the person who removes the exit. Outside, dawn broke over the precinct windows. The case file closed heavier than most. Because the victims had volunteered. Because they believed suffering would fix something broken inside them. And because someone decided that if a person chooses discomfort, they also choose danger. That is the lie at the center of this case. Choice requires truth. Without truth, there is only manipulation. And once the door closes without a real latch, what you are testing is not endurance. It is survival. The press conference lasted 9 minutes. 9 measured minutes in which the department confirmed arrests, confirmed charges, and declined to describe the freezer units in detail. Rachel Monroe stood behind the line of microphones, but did not speak. The captain handled the statement. Words like complex investigation and multi-agency coordination filled the space where panic might have spread. They avoided one word intentionally: voluntary. Because the moment the public hears that victims walked into a confined space on purpose, sympathy fractures. And this case did not need fractured sympathy. It needed clarity. Back inside, calls began almost immediately. Not from reporters. From civilians. 2 men, 1 woman, each asking a version of the same question. Is this about that endurance trial? The sponsored links had circulated quietly for weeks. More people had seen them than Len ever contacted. Rachel sat with cyber investigations as they traced the ad footprints deeper. The posts had not only targeted individuals expressing self-doubt, they had also responded to grief threads, loss, divorce, career collapse, athletic injury, any moment where someone questioned their own resilience. The algorithm wasn't automated. It was manual. Len had read each post, selected profiles, flagged vulnerabilities, forwarded intake candidates to Voss. Voss screened for psychological suitability. Len screened for psychological fracture. That distinction defined the line between therapy and exploitation. Midday, Nikil Rao agreed to a formal recorded interview. He sat upright, hands folded tightly together. I thought it was like a cold plunge challenge, he said. With supervision? Less. You understood there would be discomfort. Less. But you believed there was exit. Of course. Rachel studied him. What made you respond to the ad? He hesitated. I've been researching stress thresholds for my thesis, but I keep stopping experiments early. I thought maybe I'm too cautious. You equated caution with weakness. Yes. Who told you that? He blinked. No one. Rachel let that sit. Self-criticism does not require external instruction. It only requires reinforcement. You were on your way when officers stopped you, she said. Yes. Would you have closed the door? He looked down. Yes. That answer carried weight. Because it was honest. Back in holding, Len requested to see news coverage. Denied. Instead, he asked through counsel whether Emily Carver had survived. Rachel was informed of the question but chose not to respond directly. He did not deserve performance data. In the evidence lab, technicians reconstructed the slide plate mechanism more precisely. It had been engineered to drop automatically when the freezer door shut, guided by a gravity, fed track aligned with a concealed external latch release. No timer. No remote override. No interior disengagement. Once sealed, exit required external intervention, which meant Len had to be physically present during every endurance phase. Monitoring. Listening. Waiting. Rachel returned to the substation van to re-examine interior acoustics. When the door closed, external movement was audible from inside. Metal sliding. Footsteps shifting. Breathing near the exterior panel. Emily had not been alone in silence. She had been observed. That detail shifted the emotional gravity. The freezer was not isolation. It was performance. In interrogation follow-up, Rachel asked Len directly, "You stayed outside during each trial?" "Yes." "Why?" "To observe physiological limits." "You had no monitoring equipment." "I could hear breathing patterns." "That's not clinical. It's instinct." Rachel leaned forward slightly. "You weren't measuring resilience." He did not answer. You were measuring surrender. A flicker crossed his face. Not denial. Recognition. Later that evening, Emily Carver asked to speak privately. Rachel met her in recovery. I kept thinking if I stayed calm, he'd open it, Emily said softly. You believed it was part of the test? Yes. What changed? The air felt different. In what way? Thinner. Rachel nodded. You realized something was wrong? Yes. And then, I started banging. Rachel pictured the deep scratch marks. You didn't quit. Emily's eyes filled briefly but did not break. I tried to survive. That distinction mattered. In her office, Rachel added one final notation to the case file. Primary motivator, coercive reframing of consent, because the freezer was never the core instrument. The core instrument was narrative. You chose this. You signed. You wanted to be stronger. 3 sentences that transform harm into self-infliction. That transformation is powerful and dangerous. Near midnight, a corrections officer reported that Len had carved something into the holding cell bench using a loose screw. Rachel reviewed the photograph. 4 words. No one forced them. She stared at it for a long moment, then instructed maintenance to remove the bench entirely. The pattern had ended. The units were seized. The accounts frozen. The forum links erased. But the underlying vulnerability remained. There will always be people who believe endurance proves worth. There will always be someone willing to weaponize that belief. The difference in this case was mechanical. A sliding plate, a removed latch, a sealed door, and a man who stood outside listening for panic instead of asking whether it was justified. The forensic psychologist assigned to evaluate Marcus Len submitted a preliminary profile within 72 hours. Rachel Monroe read it alone. Primary traits: rigid cognitive structure, high intolerance for perceived weakness, moral reframing of coercion as correction, no evidence of psychosis, no dissociative episodes, no impulse instability. He knew what he was doing. He believed it was necessary. That distinction eliminated one possible defense. Across the hall, prosecutors built the charging narrative carefully. They avoided framing participants as reckless. They avoided framing the endurance trials as fringe curiosity. They framed it as fraud layered over confinement. Because the core crime was deception. Len did not abduct strangers from sidewalks. He constructed a promise, then removed the promise safeguard. In follow-up questioning, Rachel revisited a detail that had not sat comfortably. You carved messages differently for each participant, she said, through the interrogation glass during a final session.
Yes.
Why escalate language? He considered her for a moment. They needed to internalize responsibility. For what? For closing the door. Rachel leaned back slightly. You're aware closing the door was the entry condition you advertised? Yes. And you removed exit? Yes. So responsibility was impossible. He held her gaze. No. That was the fracture. He believed responsibility exists only at initiation, not continuation. Once the door closed, in his mind, the outcome belonged to them. Rachel had seen this pattern before in different forms. Perpetrators who frame harm as lesson, violence as purification, confinement as clarity. But most of them hide behind anger. Len hid behind logic. Meanwhile, Dr. Elias Voss faced a different unraveling. His attorney argued lack of intent, lack of knowledge, lack of mechanical involvement. But digital evidence told another story. After Daniel Hurst's death, Voss had drafted a private note to himself in the admin dashboard, review exit timing. Participants exiting too early compromises integrity. He had not meant death, but he had meant persistence. And persistence without control becomes danger. Rachel met him once more before formal arraignment. You built the stage, she said. I built a challenge. You built a scenario where panic was expected. Wes. You did not build sufficient fail-safes. He lowered his eyes. No. Why? He hesitated. Because if exit is too easy, the exercise becomes symbolic. Rachel's voice remained even. And if exit is impossible? He did not answer. Emily Carver's condition improved steadily over the next week. Tissue damage was limited. No permanent nerve loss expected. Aaron Patel required surgery on 2 fingers but would retain mobility. Daniel Hurst's funeral took place quietly. Rachel did not attend. She read the obituary instead. It described him as driven, self-critical, always pushing to improve, the same qualities that led him to answer the ad. In court, the prosecution played audio recovered from the substation van. A small recording device had been embedded inside the coolant housing, likely placed by Len for later review. The recording captured breathing, metal sliding, then silence broken by escalating panic. Emily's voice faintly shouting, "Open it! Open it!" The courtroom remained still. The defense objected to emotional prejudice. The judge overruled, because this was not emotional, it was factual. Marcus Len had been outside that door, listening. The trial would take months, but the structure of the case was already solid. Fraud created entry, obstruction removed exit, confinement created danger, death resulted. Rachel closed the active investigation file and transferred it to prosecutorial tracking, but she kept the photographs, not for evidence. For reminder, the freezer units had been dismantled and scrapped under court order, steel plates melted down, latches destroyed, oxygen ports sealed permanently. Yet the phrase lingered in her mind. He chose this. Choice without full knowledge is not choice. Choice under manipulation is not consent. Choice without exit is not agency. Late that evening, she stood alone in the evidence bay where the first van had been processed weeks earlier. The floor had been cleaned, the metal table cleared. Only faint coolant staining remained near the drainage grate. She replayed Daniel Hurst's final words in her memory. He said I could leave. That sentence was not accusation. It was confusion. And confusion is often the first indicator that someone has been missiled. Cases involving violence often end with confrontation. Gunshots, struggles, confessions under pressure. This case ended with mechanics, bolts, slides, seals, and a belief system that equated endurance with worth. Outside the precinct, the city moved normally. People entered gyms, signed contracts, agreed to challenges. Most of them safe, most of them informed. But there will always be someone offering transformation through suffering, and there will always be someone willing to close a door believing it proves something. The responsibility of law enforcement is not to protect people from discomfort. It is to protect them from deception disguised as opportunity. Marcus Len removed exit. Elias Voss removed clarity. Together, they created inevitability. And inevitability, once engineered, does not test strength. It measures survival. 3 weeks after the arrests, something small surfaced that refused to settle. It was not evidence of another victim, not another freezer, not another van, not another carved phrase. It was a forum post. Archived. Time-stamped 2 nights before Daniel Hurst entered the first unit. The username was not Second Horizon. It was something else. Cold truth. The post read, "Most people don't quit because they're weak. They quit because they expect the door to open." Rachel Monroe read the sentence twice. The phrasing was different from Voss's clinical tone, different from Len's accusatory carvings, but the ideology was identical. Cyber traced the account history, minimal activity, sparse replies, but precise engagement with threads centered on self-doubt and performance anxiety. The account had interacted directly with Daniel Hurst. 2 messages exchanged. Daniel wrote, "I think I just need someone to remove the option to back out." Cold Truth replied, "Careful what you ask for." Rachel leaned back in her chair. The line between invitation and warning blurred there. She requested deeper archival scraping. The account originated from a public terminal in the same co-working space used to incorporate Second Horizon. Timestamp correlation placed the login within the same 2-hour window as the shell company filing, which meant either Voss or Len, or both, had used it. In interrogation transcripts, neither had mentioned the alias. Rachel scheduled a follow-up question for both. Len answered first. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I used it." "Why the warning tone?" "It wasn't a warning. It reads like one." He tilted his head slightly. "It was a test." "For what?" "To see who would still respond." Daniel had responded. That detail carried weight. "You were filtering for people willing to surrender exit?" Rachel said. "Yes." "You escalated messaging before formal recruitment?" "Yes." "So Daniel's consent began before payment?" "Yes." Rachel absorbed that. Consent shaped gradually through suggestion is not consent. It is conditioning. Voss, when confronted with the alias, appeared genuinely unsettled. I didn't authorize that, he said. Did you know Len was communicating separately? No. Did you monitor his forum activity? No. You gave him access to participant psychology, Wes, and assumed he shared your ethics. Silence. Rachel did not press further. The forum archive revealed one more detail. After Daniel's death, but before the second van was deployed, Cold Truth posted again. Thresholds only matter when the safety net is gone. That sentence reframed everything. Len had escalated after Daniel, not because Daniel died, but because Daniel had tried to exit. In Len's worldview, that attempt invalidated the purity of the test, so he removed even the illusion of safety. The slide plate had not been the beginning. It had been the refinement. Rachel added the archived posts to the prosecutorial packet. Premeditation now extended beyond mechanics. It extended into psychological grooming. Upstairs, Nikhil Rao returned voluntarily to provide supplemental testimony. I kept thinking about the phrase, he said quietly. What phrase? Rachel asked. He told me during a preliminary call, before the formal intake, that growth requires irreversible commitment. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. Irreversible. Yes. Did that concern you? I thought he meant mentally. And if he had meant physically? Rao hesitated. I probably would have rationalized it. That answer revealed the true danger. Not gullibility. Rationalization. People rarely step into harm blindly. They step into narratives that make harm meaningful. Later that evening, Rachel visited Daniel Hurst's case file once more. The autopsy report, the financial transfers, the intake questionnaire. In the margin of his intake form, Daniel had written one additional sentence under the prompt. What do you hope to gain from this trial? I want to stop quitting. Rachel closed the file. Daniel had not been reckless. He had been tired of himself. Len saw that fatigue and interpreted it as invitation. The next morning, Marcus Len requested a final statement to be included in the record. Rachel attended. He sat upright, composed as ever. You think I'm a monster, he said. I think you engineered inevitability, she replied. They walked in. You locked it. They wanted proof. You removed choice. He leaned forward slightly. If they had survived longer, you would call it resilience. Rachel did not respond immediately. Resilience requires recovery, she said finally, not confinement. He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, people don't know who they are until escape is impossible. Rachel held his gaze. That's not revelation, she said. That's coercion. He leaned back again. Conversation over. The prosecution would present the mechanics, the grooming, the financial fraud, the slide plates, the carved ad solutions. But beneath all of it lay a simpler truth. The door was designed to close. It was never designed to open. And anyone who builds a system where exit depends on another person's decision does not test endurance. They test obedience. The trial began 4 months after Daniel Hurst was found in the back of a refrigerated van. 4 months of motions. 4 months of forensic review. 4 months of argument over the meaning of consent. By the time opening statements were delivered, the narrative had sharpened into 2 competing frames. The defense argued participation, voluntary entry, signed agreements, assumed risk. The prosecution argued deception, withheld information, engineered obstruction, manufactured inevitability. Rachel Monroe sat behind the prosecution table during testimony, not as lead speaker but as the architect of the timeline. The timeline mattered, because every decision made by Marcus Len could be placed against a moment of awareness. Daniel Hurst's death, the modification of the latch, the escalation of messaging, the second and third vans. This was not a single tragic miscalculation. It was adjustment, refinement. When the recording from the substation freezer played in court, the room remained silent long after it ended. Emily's voice echoing faintly, metal sliding, breathing outside the door. That breathing became the center of the case, because it proved presence. Len had been there, not absent, not negligent, not unaware. Present, listening. The defense attempted to reframe the obstruction plate as an experimental safeguard meant to discourage premature termination. The prosecution countered with mechanical diagrams. No internal override. No timer. No emergency fail-safe. Discouragement does not require elimination of exit. Elimination requires intent. Dr. Elias Voss testified under subpoena. He admitted to flawed design, admitted to insufficient fail-safes, admitted to believing that discomfort revealed character. But when asked whether he authorized the obstruction plates, his answer was consistent. No. His negligence would carry consequences. But the courtroom gravity centered on Len. When he took the stand, his composure did not crack. He did not deny installing the plates. He did not deny carving the messages. He did not deny monitoring the trials. He denied only one thing. That I forced them, he said calmly. The prosecutor stepped closer. When the door sealed, could they exit? No. Did they know that? No. Did you? Yes. Silence settled across the room. That exchange required no embellishment. In closing arguments, the prosecution did not describe the freezers in vivid language. They described the slide, the small, simple steel plate, gravity-fed, externally aligned, activated by closure, a design whose sole function was to remove independent exit. They described the carved messages as narrative manipulation. He chose this. You signed. You wanted to be stronger. You not statements of fact, statements of deflection. The verdict returned after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all major counts for Marcus Len. Guilty on criminal negligence and fraud for Elias Voss. Sentencing followed weeks later. Len received life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Voss received a substantial custodial sentence and permanent revocation of his license. The courtroom emptied slowly after sentencing. Rachel remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Not because of satisfaction, because of weight. Daniel Hurst would not return. Emily Carver would carry scars, physical and psychological. Aaron Patel would measure winter differently for the rest of his life. Nikhil Rao would complete his thesis with a footnote he never expected to write. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked whether this case would change regulation around private endurance programs. Rachel declined comment. Regulation can address mechanics. It cannot regulate self-doubt. Weeks later, the final administrative task arrived. Authorization to destroy remaining physical evidence not required for archival preservation. The last intact freezer unit, retained for trial demonstration, was scheduled for dismantling. Rachel observed as technicians removed the latch assembly one final time. They detached the mounting bracket, unbolted the hinge, removed the sliding track guide. When the plate was lifted free, it looked smaller than memory suggested. Just a shaped piece of steel, no larger than a forearm, light enough to hold in one hand, and yet heavy enough to remove autonomy from another human being. She watched as it was placed into the smelting container. Metal against metal. Final. Back at her desk, she closed the digital case file. Before doing so, she added a final note to the internal summary. Primary mechanism. Engineered removal of exit disguised as voluntary challenge. Because that was the lesson. Not about cold exposure. Not about endurance. Not about psychological thresholds. About exit. Choice only exists when leaving remains possible. Without that, every closed door becomes something else. Some doors are locked by fear. Some by coercion. Some by belief. But the most dangerous doors are the ones that appear open, until they close behind you. If you follow these cases closely, remember this one. Not for the mechanics. Not for the freezers. Not for the carved phrases. Remember it for the moment the latch should have worked, and didn't. Because that is where the truth was, not in the signing, not in the closing, not in the panic, but in the absence of a way out. If this case stayed with you, subscribe for more investigations where every detail counts. And in the comments, tell me, what was the moment you knew something didn't add up?